أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Continuing with our discussion in Ijtihad and Taqlid, we were talking about going to the Quran and using the Quran for Ijtihad. And some of the problems, or not problems, but challenges we have there, where a person needs to have extra expertise. And that is the Asbabun Nuzul. The discussion of Asbabun Nuzul is one that has a lot of details once again, but this is most of those details will pertain to the Quranic sciences, not to Ijtihad. But it also will play a role in our Ijtihad and our understanding of the Quran when it comes to our fiqh. And so we'll get into some examples of that as well, inshallah. First of all, the definition of Asbabun Nuzul. Asbab, of course, is the plural of sabab. Sabab means cause or reason for something, right? And so in this context, Asbabun Nuzul, or the Sababun Nuzul, is the reason why a verse was revealed. And there are different types of Asbabun Nuzul, different sababs for the revelation of verses. Sometimes there's an important event that takes place. That important event that takes place is the reason why a verse or set of verses are revealed. So for example, as a Shia will usually have the example of إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ all the way till the end. The verse that says that the ones who give sadaqah while they're in ruku', that was revealed for Imam in regards to Imam Ali and the story that we know. And so there's an important event that takes place, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to highlight something here, but the language that's used in the verse is a general language. It's an aam language. And so it can apply to more than one instance, but the sabab al-nuzul is letting us know that it's about a particular event. Now there are some discussions that we're going to have in this regard as we go forward, regarding the general language of the verse versus the particular case or particular sabab of the revelation of that verse. And we'll have examples for fiqh especially, inshallah. So that's one type of sababun nuzul. The sabab that is an important event, that is the reason why a verse was revealed. But then you also have questions that the Prophet is asked sometimes. Okay, so the Prophet is asked certain questions. As a result, verses are revealed. And we'll have many cases of those, whether it's about fiqhi rulings, whether it's about stories and history and whatnot. The Prophet is asked questions, and so a verse is revealed, or a set of verses are revealed. And usually these verses begin with words like يَسْتَنْبِئُونَكَ or يَسْتَفْتُونَكَ or يَسْأَلُونَكَ. So it says, like the verse will say, "O Prophet, they ask you of this. Tell them this." Okay, obviously, these verses are revealed as a result of questions being asked. So, for example, the story of Prophet Yusuf or the Ashabul Kahf, these ones, they say that these were revealed as a result of the people asking the Prophet, sometimes even testing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in regards to stories of the past and history of those who came before him. But usually these will begin with yas'alunaka, they ask you. Yastaftunaka means they ask you for a verdict on. Yastaftunaka comes from ifta and fatwa. So they're asking you for a fatwa. Yastanbi'unaka, they're asking you to give them news of something. Yastanbi'unaka comes from naba, which means news. Okay. So sometimes it's an important event. As a result, verse or verses are revealed. Sometimes it's a question the Prophet is asked. Sometimes no, Islam wants to make clear its stance regarding something. Okay? And so verses or a verse are revealed. For example, in the whole story of li'an or dhihar we have, that we'll probably talk about later. In these cases, Islam wanted to make clear what its stance is on a particular issue. And so these verses are revealed. As a result of something coming up amongst the people are like, let's ask about this. And so it doesn't say necessarily that they asked a question, but something happened, someone did something, and as a result of that, the Islam needs to make clear its stance on the matter, and so a verse or a set of verses are revealed. So these are different different types of asbabun nuzul that we have. Now, how do we find out that or figure out what the sababun nuzul of a verse is? First of all, let me make it clear, although once again these are Quranic sciences that we're going through right now. These discussions are not fiqhi necessarily, but I'm just saying this on the side. That how do we know a verse or set of verses has a sababun nuzul? It's not that every single verse of the Quran has a sababun nuzul, by the way. It's not like Allah is waiting for something to happen, for a question to come up, and then verses are revealed. Sometimes that was the case, sometimes no. Initially, Allah will send verses in regards to a particular matter. So how do we know if the verse or verses we're looking at, these are ones that have sababun nuzul or not? Well, we'll have either hadiths for that, reports for that. So for example, lots of times you'll see Ibn Abbas's name. Ibn Abbas said this verse was revealed for this. This verse was revealed for that. And we'll talk about this later as well, the reports of Ibn Abbas and similar ones. We'll talk about that. There's some points there as well that Tabatabai brings up. So it's either a hadith or a report that reaches us that this verse or set of verses had a reason for it being revealed. Or no, we'll have in the history books, it's not a hadith like Qala Sadiq this or the Prophet said that. No, but in the history books it tells you a story and then it will add to it maybe that these verses were revealed because of this. And then we also have dedicated books that will discuss the Asbab al-Nuzul. Now obviously those dedicated books for Asbab al-Nuzul, they're getting their reports from history or hadith and other reports. But all in all, I just want to make the point that there are books now, and there's many of them I think, where you will have all of the different Asbab al-Nuzul, yes, accumulated, compiled into one book or set of books. Yeah, and the Shi'as have that, the Sunnis have that as well. These are famous books that are out there. Okay, so we have different types of Asbab al-Nuzul. There are different ways of, reading up on the Sabab al-Nuzul of a verse or set of verses. Now, how does that have to do with Ijtihad? What does that have to do with Ijtihad? Because, for example, the story of Prophet Yusuf, if they're asking the Prophet about Yusuf, alayhi salam, or if they're asking the Prophet about Ashabul Kahf, and that is the Sabab al-Nuzul, the reason for the revelation of those verses, okay, that's a story, that's history. Sometimes it's the beliefs that we have. It's not fiqh and ijtihad. How does this have to do with ijtihad? Well, it has a lot to do with ijtihad. Now, how many cases we can find in the Quran? We'll have to see. Fiqhi cases that have to do with Islamic law and legal theory. But they are there, and when they are there, it's a very important discussion. So, for example, an example of how knowing what the sabab al-nuzul is for a verse or a set of verses helps us in our fiqh is the verse that we have in our slide where it says inna safa wal marwata min sha'airillah. Okay, a very important discussion. Hajj and Umrah, which is all fiqhi, right? Min sha'airillah faman hajj al-bayt aw i'tamara fala junaha alayh. La junaha alayh. That's the important part. أن يطوف بهما. So verily Safa and Marwa are some of Allah's, now here it says waymarks, one of those sacraments. Whosoever makes a pilgrimage, to the Kaaba or performs Umrah, there shall be la junaha alayh, no blame on them to go around Safa and Marwa, to circuit back and forth between Safa and Marwa. Okay. La junaha, there's no problem in that. Question, when you go to Hajj or Umrah and you're muhrim, is it okay for you to go between Safa and Marwa, or is it wajib on you to go between Safa and Marwa? One of the a'mal of Hajj and Umrah are what? To perform the 7 times Safa and Marwa, going between Safa and Marwa, right? Can anyone, or does any Muslim out there believe that it's something that is optional, not obligatory? Everyone knows one of the main a'mal is Safa and Marwa. But what does the verse say? فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْهِمَا. No problem. If you would like, go ahead. This is where the Sabab al-Nuzul plays a huge role. And this is just one example, of course. A huge role in understanding that La junaha here means no, it's yajib alayka. Okay? Because of the Sabab al-Nuzul. Why was this verse revealed? Because during the Prophet's time or pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah times, the people that would perform Hajj, we all know the Hajj was totally defaced. Everything about it was destroyed. The Hajj was supposed to be all about pure Tawheed, and so they had brought the idols in and all the problems that came with it. And so those of you who have read up on how the Hajj was before Islam, you'll see that the Abrahamic Hajj that was all about Tawheed was totally destroyed. And so the people had different practices that were totally unacceptable when they were performing Hajj. So the question the people had back then was that, okay, now that Islam has come, now that we have the Hajj or the Umrah, the pre-Islamic people were performing the sa'i of Safa and Marwa, actually. Should we continue doing that, or is this something Jahiliyyah times has added to the Hajj? And the Quran says, no, that's okay. It's okay. It's okay doesn't mean it's okay that you don't have to do it, but if you do it, it's fine. It's okay meaning, no, there's no problem in it because you think that there might be a problem because this is something that is making its way in after Islam, and it belonged to pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah times. No. This is actually one of those acts and rituals of the Hajj. So la junaha means don't worry about it. Keep doing it. Not don't worry about it. If you would like to do it, do it. If you don't want. But how did we figure this out? The sabab al-nuzul plays a huge role in this matter. Of course, I do want to add that you'll have other hadiths and other traditions that will explain that this is part of the Hajj. Okay? Or the Prophet's last Hajj that he performed, Hajjatul Wida, all of these things, or Imam al-Baqir's famous hadith on Hajj, and the different amal of Hajj, all of these will also explain to us. If it was just us in the verse though, we would have this issue. We have other hadiths that help us, but if it was just us in the verse, since we have the sabab al-nuzul, we're set. Since we have the sabab al-nuzul, we can understand what is meant by la junaha alayh here. Okay. So, another question that comes up now, and this is the main issue here. That was just an example I gave you. What we have is the big question of, is the sababun nuzul that now we know of? Let's say we become 100% sure, we have a hujjah, that this is the sababun nuzul of the verse. This is the big question here. Is the sababun nuzul a qualifier for the verse or not? Qualifier, in Arabic you'll say mukhassis or muqayyid, they'll say. Something that will narrow down the wide general scope of the verse or not. So for example, we had the story of Imam Ali, right? And him giving sadaqah in ruku'. Can we say that, okay, this has to do with Imam Ali only, and so the verse, although it's using general language, it only applies to Imam Ali? Or no, do we say the language is general, the sabab is specific, but the sabab is not strong enough to narrow down the general language of the verse, and it's going to remain applicable to everybody? All right, what's the rule? What's the exception in this? Okay, this is the important thing that we have to discuss. I don't know where that noise comes from. Okay, and this is where they've made the discussion. It's a very nice discussion. They'll say, look, either the language is general. Okay, I want your attention here. The language is general language, but the sabab is a specific one. The occasion of the revelation, the reason for the revelation is a specific story or case or incident. Sometimes it's like that. Sometimes no. The language is specific and the sabab al-nuzul is also specific. These are two different things. We have to figure each of these out. One of them is going to be easier than the other one. The harder one is, if the language is general, can I take a specific sababun nuzul for that verse to say that the verse is also narrow in scope? Can I say that or not? That's the question. What is the rule here? The rule here, they've explained, is that no. The sabab, even though it's specific, cannot narrow down the general language and scope of the verse. It cannot. The rule is that the general language applies to more than that case. That was the sababun nuzul. This is very, very important here. We have to understand. And this is something that the Shia and the Sunnis widely believe in, although there might be some exceptions here and there. when I was looking at it. But all in all, the rule that they apply is al-ibratu bi'umum al-lafz la bi khusus al-sabab. That what matters and what counts is the general language of the verse, not the specific story that's behind it, or cause that was behind it, the sabab that was behind it. Okay? I'll give you some examples. And fiqhi examples. Dhihar, li'an. These are two things that I said we'll talk about later. Now's the time. In the Jahiliyyah times, there was this practice that they had. When a husband would get really angry at his wife, okay, what he would do was, he would do dhihar. Dhihar means that you say, you're like my mother. To your wife, you say, you're like my mother. In other words, it's as if we're not married to each other. Okay? To say dhihar, dhahruki ka dhahri umri, that you are like my mother. And there's different understandings of what this formula means. Dhahruki ka dhahri umri, or dhahartuka, or whatever, dhahartuki, whatever they would use of formulas back then. What the exact literal meaning is not relevant right now. All in all, this person would say, you're still my wife, but my relationship with you is going to be one of me and my mother's. Okay? Alright. What does that mean? That means she's not your wife, but she still can't marry someone else. Alright? That's what they would do back then. This was a Jahiliyyah practice. Someone did this. His wife went and complained to the Prophet, according to the sabab al-nuzul of this verse that speaks about dhihar. Spoke to the Holy Prophet about it, complained to him about it. The Quran, we have the verse that was revealed that says that no, you can't do this, and there's a huge kafara if you do this. One, you either free a slave. Then if you can't, then you have to fast for like 60 days. And it's not that you can fast 60 days throughout the year. No, it has to be every day. That you have to do it 60 days back to back. And if that's not possible, then 60 poor people and all the way till the end. Okay, so there's a big kafara that's now prescribed for one who does dhihar. And the Quran is speaking in general language. Whoever does this is what's going to happen to them. The kafara is going to be on them. Okay, so we have general language here. But then we have a specific case that someone did this. They got angry and they did this, and this wife went to the Holy Prophet and complained to him. Which one do we take? Do we say that the verse is general language? But this is a specific case and story. So this is going to be a qualifier for that. It's going to make that general language applicable to only a specific case, which is that guy. When the Quran is speaking about dhihar, and this is the kafara of dhihar, for that guy who did this, not for the rest who might do this. I think it's kind of laughable actually, right? To think that this is only for a specific person only. No, the language is general. Al-ibratu bi'umum al-lafz. That the language is the language is general, and so it's going to be general and applicable to anyone who falls under the category of dhihar. Another one, li'an. Yes, brother. I guess we'll never know. So the question he's asking is, what if that person who did dhihar had never done that dhihar? Yeah, this ruling would have never happened because the verse was sent down because of that sabab, because of that cause, because of that story. Does that mean that this rule of Islam, this kafara, would have never been sanctioned, never been prescribed if that incident hadn't taken place? My answer would be not necessarily. Yes, not necessarily no. Okay? For example, we'll have cases where something had never come up during the Prophet's time and the rule was not known. And so they asked the later Imams about it. And the Imams explained the ruling. Who knows? If dhihar had never come up during the Prophet's time and had come up later, maybe the Imams would have explained what the ruling was, although the ruling was there even during the Prophet's time. Okay? But because it had never come up, it would have never been mentioned. Maybe that's the case. Sometimes no, the answer might be that no, still the Prophet would have mentioned this because this is an important matter. We don't know exactly. Case by case, we'll have to see. And this is part of a broader discussion about asbabun nuzul, all in all. Not just a fiqhi one, but just all in all, a lot of the other things. Would Prophet Yusuf's story would it have been sent down if the people hadn't asked about it? Or Ashabul Kahf, would it have come? That's a good question. It's a Quranic sciences discussion. Some might say yes, some might say no, actually. We'll have to see what your take is on the Quran itself and why the Quran is revealed to begin with. Are the verses of the Quran ones that have to be sent down in this way no matter what? Or no, some of it yes, some of it will be the result of questions that are asked. There's a big discussion there in Quranic sciences of how much of a role does Asbab al-Nuzul play in the Quran being sent down. Is that good enough for now? So the next example is li'an. Li'an, as you all probably know, if anyone accuses a believer of adultery and indecency, without having enough witnesses for it, what happens? They get the punishment, right? We've all heard that, right? You can't just go around falsely accusing people of indecency. And so if there's a punishment like that for those indecencies, if a person without the proper witnesses makes such an accusation, even if they've seen it themselves, Islamically they're the one in trouble. Islam doesn't want these things to be spread in society. Okay, someone does something wrong behind closed doors, as long as it's behind closed doors. If it reaches a point though that society is in such bad shape that 4 people see something that bad, then okay, it's time to maybe take out the tools for surgery. And so there are certain punishments that come. But if someone accuses without having those witnesses, they get in trouble. They get the punishment that might have been there for the ones who have committed such a sin. Okay, now that is the story behind accusing people of indecencies. Now, what if a husband though, he walks in and sees something like that happening and makes the accusation? Here an exception has been made. Okay? An exception has been made. He goes to the hakim, he goes to the judge, he says, I saw this myself in my own home. Well, where are your 4 witnesses? I don't have 4 witnesses. Okay, what's the rule then? If you don't have enough witnesses, you're the one who's going to get punished. But in this case, in this particular case, where the one who's accusing is a husband because it's his own home. I mean, how is he going to have 4 people over every time something like that might happen? You know what I'm saying? Doesn't make sense. Islam made a way out for him in such a case. But it's going to be a rough and harsh one. How? Li'an. And so there's a story behind this, that this happened. He went to the Prophet, etc. And so the Quran said, this is what you do. Li'an. Question. And I'll explain what this li'an is all about. But the question is this. If the story has to do with one person, does li'an apply to everyone or just that one person? Once again, here they say, obviously, the general language of the verse and the rule applies to just more than just the person that this story took place for. Okay? So what is the story? What is this li'an all about? Li'an comes from la'an, and sending curses. Okay? And la'na upon each other. Li'an is a 2-way la'an. Okay? It comes from mula'ana. Okay. What happens is, the husband, when he makes such an accusation, because he's seen it, it's his own home, the judge will say, okay, you don't have 4 witnesses, you are to be punished. But if you do li'an, which means that you swear to Allah that this has happened, and that may the la'an, and I hope I'm getting the details right. Right now I'm a little blurry, but he swears by Allah that he saw this and that she did this, and she's lying that she didn't, and that they sent, may the la'na of Allah be upon me if I'm one of the liars. And then she also, what she has to do is she also has to say that in order so that she doesn't get punished, she also swears by Allah that, I didn't, this is not me, I didn't do this, and that may the la'na of Allah be upon me if I'm one of the liars, or something along those lines, brothers. It's been a long time, and trust me, this never comes up, okay? So the rulings for this, I'm not remembering them for some reason. It's a famous fiqhi matter. As a result of this li'an, these 2 are separated from each other, okay? But none of them gets the punishment either, although there weren't 4 witnesses involved in this whole thing. The moment you don't have 4 witnesses in a process like this, someone's going to get punished. But this is the exception, because there's a li'an involved that took place in the presence of the judge, Islamic judge. li'an. So that's the rule. That's the fiqhi matter that we have called li'an. The verse speaks of it in a very general language once again. But will anyone out there dare say, oh, this only applies to that one case where that person, had this issue? No. It applies to everybody who does li'an. Once again, no one does li'an anymore. These are in the past. Another one is as-sariqu was-sariqah. Once again, if there's a story behind that story of, and they say there is a story there, that someone's armor was stolen, some say someone's cloak was stolen, whatever it was, whatever the story was. And of course, you all have heard almost 20 conditions have to be met before the actual punishment for stealing takes place. Okay? If you're going to carry out the punishment for theft, there is a ton of conditions that have to be met, okay, before the punishment is carried out, because it is a harsh punishment. For example, one of the conditions is that it shouldn't be a year of drought. If it's a year of drought, people will probably have no choice but to steal. If the person stole, as I said, there's many conditions. One of them has to be that they have to have broken into a lock, not just something sitting there, they take it. Okay, all of these conditions have to be met before the punishment takes place. What do? The ones who are Islam haters, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, see, Islam has a punishment for thieves, and it's a harsh one. Yeah, but the conditions are barely ever met. Okay. Anyway, the conditions, if they are met, then the punishment is there. The Quran says, as-sariqu as-sariqatu faqta'u aydiyahuma. This is the punishment for the thief or the thiefess, if that's the feminine form of it. The woman who's a thief or a man that's a thief. They have this punishment. Okay, but the story had to do with a certain individual. So maybe we should just apply the ruling there. Here, the jurists have said, and the mujtahideen have said, no. The sabab al-nuzul is not a qualifier for the ruling itself. Okay? And finally, I'll share this with you as well. There's a verse of the Quran, this is not fiqhi, but the Imam has explained it very, he's gotten very specific here, so I want to share this as well with you. That there's a verse in the Quran that says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى حَرْفٍ. There are some people who will worship God, right? But their worship of God is so weak, it is so contingent among other things, that the moment anything goes wrong, they stop worshiping God. يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى حَرْفٍ. Right? In Farsi you might say, Sarage harf kuchulu. Over something very small, they worship Allah. Once that thing is gone, they stop worshiping Allah. The Quran is calling these people out. Just because the going gets tough doesn't mean you give up and turn away. Yeah? So they say that this also has to do with a certain individual. The person is asking Imam as-Sadiq about this. Then the Imam, he says this. He says, قال إن الآية تنزل في الرجل ثم تكون في أتباعه. Yes, the verse is revealed about somebody specific, a rajul, a person. But then it will also apply to those who follow this person's footsteps as well. That the verse is calling out anybody who happens to worship Allah, follow Allah, yes, and adopt the religion of Allah, but ala harfin. For the smallest reasons, they might just give it up. Okay? So, as you can see, it's pretty obvious. The rule is, the sababun nuzul is not going to be a qualifier for the general scope of a verse. But we have exceptions. And so this is where really the expertise comes into the picture. This is where a mujtahid has to be able to do what they need to do. So for example, you'll have exceptions though. Let's go back to the Shia example. Yeah? إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ يُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَهُمْ رَاكِعُونَ. That verily your wali is Allah. Right? And His Prophet and Messenger, and those who give their zakat while they're in ruku'. Alright. Does anyone, at least any Shia, doubt that this, although there's a general language here in the verse, it's saying what? Anyone who gives zakat when in ruku' is your wali. But does anyone believe that other than Imam Ali is meant here? But the language of the verse is general. The sababun nuzul, you're taking it as a qualifier. We say, yeah, but here, the context, yeah, all you need to do is take a little sniff, and the context speaks to you that this is speaking about one person, or whatever that case was that the verse was revealed for. Not everybody. And that's why you won't find anyone of the fuqaha, anyone of the mujtahideen, saying it is mustahab to give sadaqah when you're in ruku'. Based on what? Based on this verse. Yeah, giving sadaqah all in all is mustahab. You can give it when you're in sajda. You can give it when you're in ruku'. You can give it when you're standing in prayer, out of prayer, whatever. That is one thing. Generally speaking, it's mustahab to give sadaqah, and if you just so happen to be in ruku', fine. But no, giving sadaqah in ruku' specifically, is that something that Islam says is mustahab in and of itself? No. Sadaqah all in all is mustahab. But in this specific case, it brought significance to that individual. And it is so powerful, the context here is so strong and heavy. It doesn't allow you to generalize. Although they do say that there were some people during the time of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam who started giving sadaqah in ruku'. Maybe this verse will apply to us too. Get out of here. It's obvious that this verse is speaking about a specific case. So there are exceptions here to this rule. But the rule is, yes, the sabab al-nuzul cannot be a qualifier when the language of the verse is general language. Now sometimes though, you will have a specific sabab al-nuzul, but the language of the verse that was revealed as a result of that sabab is also specific. Example, can anyone think of an example? Any names in the Quran that we have that the verses speak of? So who was bothering the Prophet the most in his time? Abu Lahab. Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab. Ma aghna anhu maluhu wa ma kasab. Yeah? Sayasla naran dhata lahab, all the way till the end. Okay, obviously this surah is revealed in honor of Abu Lahab. Think about it. It's an honor really for your name to be mentioned in the Quran, right? But not in this way, people. Let it be mentioned in a good way, not in a bad way. Here, Abu Lahab is getting destroyed by verses of the Quran. Alright, as a result of what he was doing. So we have an obvious, specific sabab al-nuzul. Abu Lahab and all he was doing. But the language of the verse, is it specific or general? Specific too. Who is it talking about? It's talking about Abu Lahab. So here we have an issue. We understand, okay, these verses are speaking of Abu Lahab. They don't pertain to anybody else. Yeah, you can draw general conclusions from this. Drawing general conclusions is one thing, but to say that the verse itself is applying to more than Abu Lahab, that's really pushing it too much. Because here the language of the verse is also specific. Unlike previous case that we had, where the language is general, but the sabab was specific. Alright, so these are all details here a faqih and jurist has to look at. Right? First they'll determine, is the language general or not, which usually it is. And then if that's the case, is the sabab going to be a qualifier for this general language and scope or not? That's what a faqih has to do. So they have to have a grasp of the Quranic verses, the sabab al-nuzuls. Once they have established that there is a sabab al-nuzul, that they have hujjah for, is it going to be a qualifier or not? Yeah, all of these will play into that ijtihad that they have for that kind of verse. Now, having said all of that though, there is something on the side that I want to explain and mention before we end. And that is that we have two problems that Tabatabai, Allama Tabatabai, he points out regarding the sabab al-nuzul of verses. Right? Here we are thinking, okay, there's a book out there, it's called Asbab al-Nuzul, and so we get our hands on that. Now we know why each of these verses that had a sabab al-Nuzul, why it was revealed. Alhamdulillah, so pretty, so nice and clear cut. That's not the case. We have major problems when it comes to Asbab al-Nuzul. That's why if you notice, I keep saying this again and again. Once it's established for a jurist that there's a sabab al-Nuzul for a verse, once a person has hujjah that this is the sabab al-nuzul, then they have to start doing their ijtihad. But what if it's not established? Well, how can it not be established? There's books out there that have taught us what the asbab al-nuzul are. No. Each of these reports has to be analyzed separately. Each sabab al-nuzul, we have to see who said it, where did it come from? And most importantly, is it contradicted by other sabab al-nuzuls? Yes, we have verses that will have different sabab al-nuzuls that will contradict each other. Which one is it? That's the problem. You see, and this is the issue that we have when it comes to ijtihad and taqlid. Sometimes the brothers and sisters out there, they might think that, okay, we'll just look at the hadith and we'll just judge based on it. How do you know where this hadith came from? I'll just look at the sabab al-nuzul and I'll see what I'm going to do. No, how do you know this sabab al-nuzul is actually a valid one? Do we have the tools to establish that? Ascertain it or not? That's the big deal right there. That's the hard part. So Tabatabai, he says, if we can go to next slide. Two problems we have. The first one, before I read, is that almost 100 years of a gap, according to mainstream Shia and Sunnis, almost 100 years of a gap you have between the Prophet passing away and the actual hadiths and sayings of the Prophet being transmitted or transcribed. All right, 100 years is a lot of time. I say one thing, 5 days later, people are misunderstanding it. 100 years later, and nowadays we have all this technology. Back then there was none of that. Where did all these asbab al-nuzuls come from? The Prophet said this, the Prophet said that. Okay, so that's number one. Number two that causes issues, let's read, is that Tabatabai says, amongst the Sunnis, there are many traditions which deal with the reasons for revelation, the asbab al-nuzul. Several thousand narrations may be enumerated, although in the Shia school only a few hundred may be counted. Many of these are without a chain of narration. Like right from the get-go we have a problem. There's no sanad to begin with, and are not accepted as fully trustworthy. Moreover, a considerable number are classified as weak. You see, sometimes you don't know who said it, so there's a chance a reliable person said it, you just don't know. Sometimes you know the person who said it and you know they're a liar. So that's the difference between these two. He says sometimes they're not trustworthy, meaning they're majhul, we're not sure. Sometimes we know we're not supposed to rely on something like this. The dubious nature of the majority of these may be ascribed to the following reasons. Firstly, it is obvious from the form of many of these sayings that the narrator had not learned them through oral transmission, but rather based on their own judgment. It's not like I heard this person say, who heard from the Prophet who said it. Oral transmission is what matters when it comes to narrations. Not, oh, this is my understanding. Oh, this was mentioned because of this. Well, where are you getting that from? It's my own understanding. Who are you? I'm Ibn Abbas. Okay, who cares if you're Ibn Abbas? Did you hear one of the Ma'sumin say it or not? That's the question. He says it's obvious when we look at just the way these things are worded, that and the form of the narration is that they were based on their own judgment. That the revelation of a certain verse was connected with certain events. It's their own judgment, their own ijtihad. Thus, the narrator links a certain event to a verse of suitable meanings mentioned in the tradition. Very simple. This person did it on their own. This is a subjective view, carried out through ijtihad or personal reflection upon the matter, and not the actual reason for revelation learned orally through transmission from the Prophet. He's repeating what he said before. As proof of this argument, we may cite many inconsistencies amongst these traditions. He says, this is my proof that they were usually doing their own ijtihad, not transmitting from the Prophet. What's your reason? He says, we see inconsistencies. There are verses, for example, recorded as having several conflicting asbab al-nuzul, which are totally unconnected with each other. I'm sorry, but this verse, was it revealed once or was it revealed 10 times? Was it revealed 5 times? You're giving me 5 sabab al-nuzuls for one verse? How's that possible? And they're contradicting. Ibn Abbas, for example, who is not alone in this practice, relates several reasons of revelation, several asbab al-nuzul of one single verse. The existence of such conflicting reasons is because many have been arrived at through subjective deliberation, rather than transmitted directly from the Prophet ﷺ. Especially since 100 years have passed, brothers and sisters. 100 years have passed, and hadiths are not being transcribed or transmitted properly. Of course this is going to happen. They're going to use their own whim and understanding. This results in one narrator attributing a certain verse to a particular event, while another narrator attributes it to another event. On other occasions, he says, a narrator relates 2 different reasons for the revelation of one verse, and thus implicates himself in 2 conflicting views. That's the worst. Sometimes you say one thing, another one says something else. Sometimes you yourself say 2 things for one verse. Like, make up your mind. Then he rejects the first view in favor of the second. We are led to conclude, however, moreover, that most of these narrations are fabrications or deceitfully transmitted under the pretense of trustworthy narrators, in the name of trustworthy narrators. Such doubt concerning the validity of many of these traditions greatly endangers their credibility. Okay, so we have the same problem that we have in our hadith corpus. A mujtahid, the same problems he has to deal with when he has a hadith. He has to first figure out whether this hadith is hujjah on him or not. then he can act upon it and do ijtihad on it. Same thing with these asbabun nuzul. I first have to figure out if this really is the sababun nuzul or not. Then all the other discussions that we had before this, they come into the picture. So sababun nuzul is also one of those things that has to be studied when a mujtahid is trying to do their ijtihad, inshallah. Any questions before we end? No? Alright. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.